the chapter on ethics. You might see my dog come up. All right. Chapter 10, Jean Valjean and the Study of Right and Wrong. The door opened. A singular and violent group made its appearance on the threshold. 3 men were holding a 4th man by the collar. The 3 were gendarmes. The other was Jean Valjean. Gendarme is a fancy word for police. A brigadier of gendarmes, or police, who seemed to be in command of the group, was standing near the door. He entered and advanced to the bishop, making a military salute. In the meantime, Monseigneur Bienvenu had advanced as quickly as his great age permitted. "Ah, here you are," he exclaimed, looking at Jean Valjean. "I'm glad to see you. Well, but how is this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with your forks and spoons?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes wide and stared at the venerable bishop with an expression which no human tongue can render an account of. "Monseigneur," said the brigadier of gendarmes, "so what this man said is true, then? We came across him. He was walking like a man who is running away. We stopped him to look into the matter. He had the silver, and he told you," interposed the bishop with a smile, "that it had been given to him by a kind old fellow of a priest with whom he had passed the night. I see how the matter stands, and you have brought him back here. It is a mistake." "In that case," replied the brigadier, "can we let him go?" "Certainly," replied the bishop. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically and with a bewildered air. "Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God." The Jean Valjean character in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables was a broken, bitter man, a known thief who would surely rot in prison. Forgiven through an unexpected act of mercy, though, Valjean was eventually driven to repentance. Hugo's story bears witness to the universal reality of evil and injustice, and also to the possibility of hope and goodness. The popularity of Les Miserables, whether in book form, on stage, or in the movies, raises a hope to which all humanity clings. Brutality must give way in the face of redemption. This is perhaps the most important thing that may be said about ethical living and consequently the study of ethics. The study of right and wrong, or ethics, from the Greek word ethos meaning goodness, has 2 functions. First, it is a guide to action. Ethics seeks to answer the question, how should we live? That is, what does it mean to live a good life, and not just a life that feels good, but a life that actually is good. And if everyone lived this way, would it be good for all of us? Second, ethics proposes a way to think through what life is about. Famed journalist Walter Lippmann said, "At the core of every moral code there is a picture of human nature, a map of the universe, and a version of history. To human nature, of the sort conceived, in a universe, of the kind imagined, after a history, so understood, the rules of the code apply. Ethics is more than a guide for how to live. It has the clarifying effect of shining light on life's most important questions. Indeed, many of those questions are unanswerable without it. Christianity says all things good, true, and beautiful are based in God's character as revealed in nature and scripture. We ought to speak truth not because we'll feel better about it or because it is reasonable to do so, but because God's nature is truth. We ought to pursue justice not because it helps us maintain power or because the law commands it, but because God is just. We ought to express mercy not because it will make us happy or because it is our duty, but because God is mercy. Because God is everywhere, Christianity says an ethical system based on his character will reside in every soul across all cultures at all times. Calvin D. Linton, one-time professor at George Washington University, found that, in fact, such a basic pattern of ethical codes exists. There is a basic pattern of similarity among ethical codes. Such things as murder, lying, adultery, cowardice are, for example, almost always condemned. The universality of the ethical sense itself, or the oughtness of conduct, what you ought to do, and the similarities within the codes of diverse cultures indicate a common moral heritage for all mankind, which materialism or naturalism cannot explain. And when they say materialism, they mean the belief that all things are just matter, and naturalism comes from our definition that everything can be explained by science. There are natural consequences. Christians see common ethical systems among vastly different cultures as evidence of a universal law and thus a universal lawgiver. Every ethical system must either explain away such evidence or account for it. In this chapter, we will seek insight into the key terms and players in the field of ethics and offer an overview of the ethical theories of the 6 worldviews we are studying. Hopefully, by the end, we'll better understand why people do what they do, and we'll better understand Christian ethics. Section 2, a primer on ethics. The difference between morality and ethics. To begin, let's clarify the difference between morality and ethics. Morality refers to a personal system of determining rights and wrongs based on some standard, what we prefer, what we think is good, or what we feel duty-bound to do. Ethics is the philosophical study of morality. Morality is a container of right and wrong. Ethics is the study of how such a container is discovered and used. In most universities, the study of ethics is a subset of philosophy and is sometimes called moral philosophy. Morality and ethics are intertwined. Personally, we may proclaim our desire to live and let live, but societies can't function very well this way. In reality, Cambridge professor Simon Blackburn says, "We prefer that our preferences are shared." Sometimes Christians are criticized as intolerant busybodies who make rules about other people's business. However, intolerance works both ways. Those who become angry at restrictions on which gender of person they may marry are often delighted to support policies requiring employers to provide contraception and abortion services to their employees. Contemplating tricky questions about moral rights and wrongs goes back at least to Confucius in China, Moses in the Middle East, and Socrates in Greece. Whether in monasteries, at universities, or at sidewalk cafes, the nature of right and wrong is one of humanity's most widely discussed subjects. There are 2 theories about ethics. In his highly respected text, Introduction to Ethics, University of Texas professor John Day places all ethical theories into one of 2 categories, teleological and deontological. Let's define and explain these terms in light of the history of ethical studies. Oh yay, words. Theories about ends, or teleology. What is the good life? The first category of ethical theory is teleological. Telos is Greek for end or purpose. Teleological theories judge actions as right or wrong by their ends or purposes, those desired and intended consequences that their actions will lead to. Teleological ethics asks questions like, what is the good life? What is the purpose or end of a good life? And how might the good life be secured for as many people as possible? Teleological theories say having a good soul is what life is all about. Everyone wants happiness and peace. If they find it, they'll be good, and then society will be good. Some philosophers who thought of ethics this way include the following: Aristippus, Aristotle, Jeremy Bentham, Thomas Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Nietzsche, John Dewey, Jean-Paul Sartre. And obviously I'm going to say his name wrong. You can take a look at that list, but I want you to note the name of the philosopher and the name of the philosophy that he espoused to, also the description. But these are all teleological, okay? They talked about the ends. Everyone wants a meaningful life in harmony with others, right? This makes sense to philosophers and non-philosophers alike. But one problem for this kind of ethical theory is that people can and often do behave against their own best interests, acting out of anger or envy and spite, even when these reactions are irrational and produce misery. A second problem is that we are not always able to accurately predict the ends of our thoughts and actions. Even the wisest cannot see all ends. Gandalf tells Frodo in the Lord of the Rings trilogy about his wish to kill Gollum. Our best intentions may not actually lead to our contentment or stability for society. A third problem is that actions, like murder or stealing or hiding the truth, they might have good intentions and might even produce outcomes we find valuable, but turn out to be evil. Saying the ends justify the means has led to some of history's greatest evils. The end justifies the means is going to be a very important part of remembering teleological. Theories about duty, deontology. Yeah, I think that's how you say it. What ought we to do? The second category of ethical theories is called deontological. Deon is Greek for duty, where teleological theories determine right and wrong by the desired ends of an action. Deontological theories say that whether we like it or not, we ought to do what is right, merely because right is right. Deontological ethics rests on the belief that right and wrong actually exist independent of our situations or circumstances. The ethical question is how we might understand right and wrong and do what's right. Deontological philosophers include the following: Immanuel Kant and René Descartes. Note the name of the philosophy again and the description. Deontological theories are very compelling to those who have a conviction that truth is absolute. But if ethical absolutes exist, why do so many people seem oblivious to them? And if absolutes are truly absolute, like the law of gravity, how can people ignore them without suffering any obvious negative consequences? Plus, what do we do when ethical absolutes come into conflict with one another? Conflicts between ethical absolutes are more common than we might think. Most people understand the importance of telling the truth. They know human life is valuable. But if they lived in 1940s Poland and were hiding Jews in their homes, how would they resolve the potential conflict between the two? If the Nazis came to your door and asked, "Are you hiding any Jews?" what should you say? To say no would be to tell an untruth, but to say yes would be to condemn to death those under your protection. It is an ethical dilemma. For most people, the answer seems obvious, at least in theory. Look the Nazis in the face and mislead them. They're not owed the truth. Their laws are unjust, and the Nazis deserve to be defeated in their aims. But every aspect of this decision, what is owed, what is truth, what laws are, what constitutes justice, what it means to be deserving, whether someone should be defeated, and how to discern proper aims of authority, must be based on some standard of right and wrong. In fact, there are instances in the Old Testament where people misled evil authorities and seem to have been commended for doing so. See, for example, Exodus 1, in which the Hebrew midwives in Egypt refused to kill male babies as instructed, and in the book of Joshua, where Rahab hid the Hebrew spies and misled the authorities of Jericho who were trying to capture them. In 1 Samuel 16, when God told Samuel to use deception when he went to anoint a new king. Ethical dilemmas like these may be infrequent, but they do happen. In World War II, Corrie ten Boom decided to defy the Nazis and hide Jews in her home. During the Cold War, Brother Andrew decided to defy the laws of communist countries and smuggle Bibles across their borders. During the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr. decided to defy segregation laws and refrain from violence when attacked for doing so. Today, people rescue slaves from sex traffickers in defiance of the law. They share their Christian faith in countries where the laws specifically prohibit them from doing so. A true theory of ethics ought to be livable for human beings in a sinful world where right is not always obvious and not always easy to live out. A true theory of ethics must help us recognize that not everything legal is right, and that an unjust law has no purpose if it defies the law of God. A true theory of ethics must take into account a higher law if lower laws are not to tyrannize us. As we'll see shortly, Christianity, while not fitting neatly into either teleological or deontological categories, helps resolve these dilemmas. But first, let's examine the ethical theories of each of the 6 worldviews in our study, starting with secularism. Section 3. Secularist Austin Dacey from the Center for Inquiry says most of us would find it extremely difficult to do without the idea that there are objective standards of what makes a life go well, that we can be mistaken about what makes a life go well, and that it is hugely important that we not make such mistakes. But even the idea of life going well involves an ethical judgment. On what basis can we define well? To the secularist, such judgments may be made as long as the reasons for doing so are completely naturalistic. George Jacob Holyoake, in his 1846 book, English Secularism, said, "Secularism is a code of duty pertaining to this life, founded on considerations purely human and intended mainly for those who find theology indefinite or inadequate, unreliable, or unbelievable." Simply put, secularism binds itself to a purely naturalistic explanation of ethics. We have not found authoritative ethical prescriptions built into the order of things, writes Simon Blackburn. No God wrote the laws of good behavior into the cosmos. Nature has no concern for good or bad, right or wrong. If nature has no concern, humans certainly do, and are thus the only source of ethics according to secularism. Max Hokut elaborates. The fundamental question of ethics is, who makes the rules, God or men? The theistic answer is that God makes them. The humanistic answer is that men make them. This distinction between theism and humanism is the fundamental division in moral theory. If there is no higher authority than human beings, secularist ethics will almost always end up being seen as relativistic to one's life circumstances or cultural practices, or blanket decisions will be made about what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Thus, we suggest that secularist ethics will either be moral relativism or utilitarianism. Don't let those words scare you. What are the secularist resources for making these judgments? Must we all, as poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox phrased it, worship at the shrine of brain? We have no choice, says Blackburn, but never fear. If we are careful and mature and imaginative and fair and nice and lucky, the moral mirror in which we gaze at ourselves may not show us saints, but it need not show us monsters either. But terms like mature and fair are fraught with ethical weight. What do they mean, and who gets to define them? Secularists know we must make ethical choices based on something, but they're lost when it comes to identifying any source of how to do this without devolving into complete moral relativism. Jean-Paul Sartre, Jean-Paul, I don't know how to speak French. You could call him Jean-Paul, but I do believe it's Jean-Paul, expressed this poignantly in Existentialism and Human Emotions. The existentialist thinks it very distressing that God does not exist, because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. There can no longer be an a priori good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. Nowhere is it written that the good exists, that we must be honest, that we must not lie, because the fact is we are on a plane where there are only men. A priori good means the first good. The picture is of a besieged humanity, desperate for guidance, who, upon finding none, chooses to bravely press on in its absence. In practice, though, secularists do not abandon the search for well-placed ethical anchors. Despite their various disagreements, secularists gravitate toward explaining ethical impulses as emerging from evolutionary processes. Richard Weikert explains. Many argued that by providing a naturalistic account of the origin of ethics and morality, Darwinism delivered a death blow to the prevailing Judeo-Christian ethics, as well as Kantian ethics and any other fixed moral code. If morality was built on social instincts that changed over evolutionary time, then morality must be relative to the conditions of life at any given time. Darwinism, together with other forms of historicism ascendant in the 19th century, thus contributed to the rise of moral relativism. Having settled on social instincts derived through evolutionary processes, many secularists find themselves intrigued by the work of E.O. Wilson in a field called sociobiology. Sociobiologists seek to explain, based on evolution, why people do what they do. Mothers with a genetic impulse to protect their offspring have been more likely to have their offspring survive, for example, and this explains why human mothers will run to the aid of their crying children. Because they are convinced of naturalism and evolution, many secularists see supernatural explanations as not only wrong, but inherently dangerous. Paul Kurtz, author of Humanist Manifesto 2, stated, "The traditional supernaturalistic moral commandments are especially repressive of our human needs. They are immoral insofar as they foster illusions about human destiny, the afterlife, and suppress vital inclinations." By Kurtz's account, then, religious ethical codes such as the Ten Commandments prevent us from fulfilling our conception of the good life. Can morality be achieved without the foundation of absolute religious beliefs? Secularists hope so, but they have difficulty agreeing on what morality means without God. The need for a consistent secularist ethical standard was the impetus for Morris B. Storr's book, Humanist Ethics. Storr summed up the tensions secularists feel as they grapple with ethical issues. And this is what he said. Is personal advantage the measure of right and wrong, or the advantage of all affected? Humanists differ. Is there truth in ethics? We differ. Are right and wrong expressions of heart or head? Do people have free wills? Do you measure morality by results or by principles? Do people have duties as well as rights? We have our differences on all these and more. The debate rages on, and we can understand why. It takes a lot of thinking and discussion to make up ethical systems independent of any reliable sources of revelation. In a remarkable Time magazine article many years ago, Henry Grunwald made a stunning observation about secularist efforts to do so. We have gradually dissolved, deconstructed the human being into a bundle of reflexes, impulses, neuroses, nerve endings. The great religious heresy used to be making man the measure of all things, but we have come close to making man the measure of nothing. The idea that there is no absolute standards for ethics, but that our ethical stance is relative to our culture or to our individual situation, is called moral relativism. Many secularists protest the term relativism. Their views are much more nuanced than that, they say. In the interest of accuracy, we will not call moral relativism the ethical viewpoint of secularism. Rather, we will describe it as a thread of thought and action weaving through the last 400 or so years of philosophical consideration. This is the case William Gardner makes in the Book of Absolutes, pointing out the seeds philosophers planted that yielded the impression that God's revelation cannot be known or trusted, but that human reason and action can. Here's an overview. René Descartes. Okay, look at the dates, 1596 to 1650. By saying, "I think, therefore I am," Descartes opened the door to the idea that we are each capable of arriving at truth on our own. Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. The definition of good is that which is the object of any man's appetite. John Locke, 1632 to 1704. To know things means to understand the relationships between them rather than to discern absolute qualities. David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Our ideas of cause and effect are based on habit rather than certain knowledge. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. There's no way of knowing outside of the mind what the phenomena we observe are actually like. George Hegel, nothing stays the same, everything is evolving. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. We are free to act as we please, as long as we do not bring harm to others. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Human action is guided by will, not by the false promise of a perfect world of truth that is eternal. William James, 1842 to 1910. There is no universal knowledge of truth. What is good must be judged by its consequences. John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Even if there were absolute truths, we could not know them. We should focus on improving the world in the here and now. As we stated earlier, secularists disagree about particulars, but on these 2 points there is no debate when it comes to ethics. God has nothing to do whatsoever with it, and we're on our own. Herbert W. Schneider calls morality an experimental art, saying it is the basic art of living well together. Moral right and wrong must therefore be conceived in terms of moral standards generated in a particular society. Paul Kurtz said that moral principles should be treated as hypotheses, tested by their practical worth and judged by what they cause to happen. Situation ethics. The late Harvard professor Joseph Fletcher organized many secularist ethical teachings under the heading of situation ethics, which says that right and wrong are determined by the situations in which moral agents have to decide for the most beneficial course open to choice. By beneficial, Fletcher meant choosing the right course based on love. But how does this help if we have no real standard by which to recognize what love is? Based on his own understanding of love, Fletcher justified abortion and euthanasia. In the end, Fletcher's situation ethics became a prescription for doing whatever each person thinks is best in any given situation. One early sex education advocate, Arthur E. Gravatt, applied situation ethics this way. The morality or immorality of any behavior, including sexual behavior, has been put in the context of situation ethics. In this approach, moral behavior may differ from situation to situation. Behavior might be moral for one person and not another, or moral at one time and not another. Scientism. Secularists seem to view science as the primary guide for forming a workable ethical outlook. Harry Elmer Barnes, one of America's preeminent 20th century historians, believed that intelligent individuals would use the scientific method to determine morals, so what they conclude is by definition moral. It should be absolutely clear to any thoughtful and informed person, wrote Barnes, that morality, far from being divorced from intelligence, depends more thoroughly and completely upon intelligence and scientific information than any other phase of human thought. When the scientific method becomes the basis of a belief system, it can lead to the unwarranted belief that scientific people are more intelligent and thus more moral. Therefore, we can trust them to do what is right. Barnes was clear. Wide variations in capacity appear to be the most important single fact about the human race. It would seem to follow that there will be certain kinds of conduct which will not be harmful for the abler members of society, which indeed may be positively desirable and beneficial. There is no evidence that higher intelligence makes people more moral. While Barnes wrote this in 1925, before the Marxist purges and the Nazi gas chambers, 20th century history has taught clearly that scientism can take on a sinister character, and even when those events did occur, Barnes labored to explain them away, making himself an embarrassment to the academic community. By the end of his life, not even radical publishers would publish his ideas. Barnes's life is a cautionary tale for those who put too much faith in science and reason. In the last few decades, secularists have retooled their ethical thinking. Much of it now looks suspiciously familiar to anyone who understands the nature of Christian revelation. Secular humanist leader Paul Kurtz, for example, insisted that secular humanists accept the golden rule and even the biblical injunction to accept the aliens within our midst, respecting their differences. Secular humanists, Kurtz said, ought to tell the truth, keep promises, be honest, sincere, beneficent, reliable, dependable, show fidelity, appreciation, gratitude, be fair-minded, just, tolerant, should not steal, injure, maim, or harm other persons. Corliss Lamont also tried to borrow Christian ethics while snubbing its foundation. Any humane philosophy must include such New Testament ideals as the brotherhood of man, peace on earth, and the abundant life. There is much ethical wisdom, too, in the Old Testament and its 10 Commandments, without accepting any ethical principle as a dogmatic dictum never to be questioned. The humanist certainly adheres in general to a biblical commandment such as thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Christians can applaud that biblical morality is being upheld, and it is to Kurtz's and Lamont's credit that they knew a good idea when they saw one. What secularists fail to address, however, is why these values are worth defending as moral declarations. Cornelius Van Til's assessment is apt. They are sitting in God's lap in order to slap him in the face. In other words, secularists draw on truths explained only by God's existence and form them into arguments to deny his existence altogether. Ethical debates among secularists reveal how difficult it is to abandon an absolute standard of morality and still arrive at a coherent philosophy. Without the absolute nature of God, morality is set adrift. Will Durant admitted, "We shall find it no easy task to mold a natural ethic strong enough to maintain moral restraint and social order without the support of supernatural consolations, hopes, and fears." Francis Schaeffer added, "It is not just difficult, it is impossible." Woohoo! On to Marxism. Unlike secularists, Marxists have no difficulty making up their minds about ethics. Everything in the universe, including society, is in a state of constant change, moving society upward toward the elimination of all social and economic class distinctions. The next social advance in history will be the move from capitalism to socialism, Marxists say, which will inevitably change society's moral ideals. Anything promoting this advance, get that, anything promoting this advance is right. Anything hindering it or stopping it is wrong. This is called proletariat morality. It must be constantly borne in mind, said Howard Selsam, that Marx and Engels denied that moral ideals, moral considerations are central in human life and social evolution. Selsam would have been more accurate to say that Marxists have moral ideals, but these ideals change as circumstances change. As Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? We are evolving. Morality must evolve too. For Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, thou shalt not steal established a society in which some had property and some did not. Such an establishment was part of the old morality, the bourgeoisie, the owners. They invented it and used it to oppress the propertyless proletariat. G.L. Andreev, in What Kind of Morality Does Religion Teach?, stated, in the reigning morality under capitalism, that act is considered moral, which promotes the preservation and strengthening of the system of exploitation and the acquirement of profits. Religion merely justifies this unjust and oppressive, bloody and inhuman system in the name of God. To the Marxist, everything capitalist is immoral. Everything done to oppose it, then, is moral by definition. Marxists are grateful for any action that advances the goal of a classless society and would call it ethical. The ends justify the means. Ethics, in short, said Selsom, is good only as anything else is good, for what it can accomplish, for the direction in which it takes men. To Andreev, the means of revolution was justified. From the point of view of communist morality, the struggle against everything which hinders the cause of communist construction is moral and humane, and for this reason we consider the struggle against the enemies of communism to be of a moral nature. People who are bothered by revolution, according to Marxists, fail to understand history. Evolution is painful. It involves suffering and death, and there will be blood. Nature accumulates the good and disposes of the bad. The struggle moving us toward communism is like this. The fit must survive. The unfit, along with their social institutions, must perish. The value of hatred is right and good in the Marxist ethical code as long as it is directed toward the property owners, the bourgeoisie. Hatred is needed to fuel the clash between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, to keep their followers in a perpetual revolutionary mindset. Marxist leaders such as Mao Tse-tung, I don't know how to say that one either, Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro, and Kim Jong-un, decades after their respective revolutions wound down, dressed in military garb and peppered their speeches with revolutionary language. Marxism draws its inspiration from the hope of a more harmonious future, but draws its energy from the rehearsal of grievances against the bourgeoisie. Here's a powerful example, and one many in today's culture will find surprising. One Marxist who firmly believed in using any means to pursue proletariat morality was Ernesto Guevara, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro's right-hand man during the bloody Marxist revolution in Cuba. Che's diary, which was subsequently been turned into the movie The Motorcycle Diaries, rationalized his radical change. Traveling across South America, Che witnessed firsthand the plight of the lower class, and in response gradually embraced an ends justify the means philosophy. The reality, according to columnist Paul Berman, was anything but. The cult of Ernesto Che Guevara is an episode in the moral callousness of our time. Che was a totalitarian. He achieved nothing but disaster. Che presided over the Cuban Revolution's first firing squads. He founded Cuba's labor camp system. The present-day cult of Che, the t-shirts, the bars, the posters, has succeeded in obscuring this dreadful reality. He helped establish an unjust social system in Cuba and has been erected into a symbol of social justice. He stood for the ancient rigidities of Latin American thought in a Marxist-Leninist version, and he has been celebrated as a freethinker and a rebel. With evolution and dialectic as the building blocks of their moral philosophy, Marxists feel free to abandon long-held moral standards in pursuit of a greater good, the creation of a classless communist society. This may court disaster, but for the Marxist, all's well that ends well. If true communism results, it will be worth it. To paraphrase Vladimir Lenin, the only morality that communists recognize is that which furthers their interests. Doubtless, most Marxists begin well, with a desire to shelter the poor against injustice. This is a noble concern, and righteous people ought to share it, but what means should be employed in addressing it? The biblical view is incarnation. Enter into the brokenness of the oppressed. Care personally. Walk alongside. Bring change through the power of redemption. To those who reject God, the afterlife, or the soul, though, this response is met with impatience. Redemption is nice, but it is ambiguous and frustratingly slow. Revolution is laser sharp and thrillingly fast. Some, such as liberation theologians, hold out a genuine and heartfelt hope that we can have the best of both, but little in Marxist ethical theory supports such hope. New spirituality. New spirituality says everything is consciousness, or what some people refer to as God. The good life consists in attaining higher consciousness. When each individual does this, life will be better for all. Only one ethical absolute is possible to this way of thinking: complete freedom to act in harmony with our own understanding of truth. Free will, says Shirley MacLaine, is simply the enactment of the realization you are God, a realization that you are divine. Free will is making everything accessible to you. To new spiritualists, ethics is something that happens inside a person, not the result of divine commands or societal expectations. As Marilyn Ferguson wrote, when people become autonomous, their values become internal. Internalized values allow us to seek higher consciousness. External limits block our ability to get in touch with inner truth. As Vera Alder tells us, we should search ourselves very carefully to see if we have any fixed ideas, any great shyness or self-consciousness. If we have, we must seek freedom. Take "you shall not commit adultery," for example. Shakti Gawain says, if you're setting limits on your sexual energy, it becomes distorted. If you believe it is something to be hidden, ignored, and controlled, then you learn to hold back completely or act sexually only at certain safe moments. Randall Baer, a former New Spiritualist who converted to Christianity, stated the basic New Spiritualist credo: create your own reality according to what feels right for you. In fact, to New Spiritualists, living any other way actually hurts us. According to Eckhart Tolle, society's rules are based on ego, insisting that we are right and they are wrong. Being right is identification with a mental position, a perspective, an opinion, a judgment, a story, he says. For you to be right, of course, you need someone else to be wrong, and so the ego loves to make wrong in order to be right. This does not mean there are no absolute truths, Tolle insists. Indeed, there is truth, but thoughts and mental labels such as right and wrong cannot lead us to it. The quicker you are in attaching verbal or mental labels to things, people, or situations, the more shallow and lifeless your reality becomes, and the more deadened you become to reality, the miracle of life that continuously unfolds within and around you. In this way, cleverness may be gained, but wisdom is lost, and so are joy, love, creativity, and aliveness. The truth, according to Tolle, cannot be found in doctrines, ideologies, sets of rules, or stories. He continues, the truth is inseparable from who you are. Yes, you are the truth. If you look for it elsewhere, you will be deceived every time. Not all New Spiritualists follow such an individual path. Those who take a moral Buddhist approach recognize that certain behaviors and attitudes cause suffering and diminish happiness. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Buddhism, says, by refraining from the 10 non-virtuous actions of killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, idle gossip, covetousness, malice, and wrong view, we are restrained from causing others harm and from bringing about our own future suffering. This prepares us for a fortunate future life. If we are reborn as an animal, we will have no opportunity to engage consciously in the practice of virtue. We must therefore nurture the short-term goal of good rebirth that enables us to continue along our path toward the ultimate goal of Buddhahood. Hinduism also identifies certain traits as objectively wrong. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, hypocrisy, insolence, anger, cruelty, ignorance, conceit, these, Arjuna, are the qualities of men with demonic traits. All of these traits are wrong in the Hindu mindset because they violate universal oneness and separate us from one another. In the American context, though, New Spirituality seems irretrievably individualistic. The key to ethics is asserting this autonomy and freedom. Ferguson admitted as much. Autonomous human beings can create and invent, and they can change their minds, repudiating values they once held. The more we exercise this freedom, the more we will lose our dogmatic attachment to a single point of view. And tolerance is the key. New Spiritualists withhold judgment about morality because the truth is in each of us. Adam and Eve, says Marianne Williamson, were happy until she ate of the knowledge of good and evil. What that means is that everything was perfect until they began to judge, to keep their hearts open sometimes but closed at others. Closing our hearts destroys our peace. It's alien to our real nature. Because morality is different for each person, whatever we decide to do is right for us. Shakti Gawain says, I believe that every being chooses the life path and relationships that will help him or her to grow the fastest. One wonders what Gawain would say about history's horribles such as Genghis Khan, Thomas de Torquemada, and Adolf Hitler. Is there any accountability in new spiritual ethics? To a certain degree. The concept of karma says the consequences of what we do for good or ill will eventually be visited upon us. Shirley MacLaine defines karma this way. Whatever action one takes will ultimately return to that person, good and bad. Maybe not in this life embodiment, but sometime in the future. And no one is exempt. For every act, for every indifference, for every misuse of life, we are finally held accountable, and it is up to us to understand what those accounts might be. However, if there is no standard by which to judge an act of indifference or a misuse of life, how can we really know if we're being indifferent or misusing life? How can we distinguish the difference between cruelty and non-cruelty? This is the karmic dilemma for new spiritualists. If karma is a knowable law, then absolute ethical standards exist, and we are obligated to explain their source and obey them. Ethical relativism is false. If karmic outcomes are unknowable, though, karma can never guide our actions because we never really know whether our actions are right or wrong. New spiritualists resolve this dilemma oddly. Since everything is one, they say, any difference we perceive between good and evil and right and wrong is illusory, or it's an illusion. As Marilyn Ferguson stated, this wholeness unites opposites. In these spiritual traditions, there is neither good nor evil. There is only light and the absence of light, wholeness and brokenness, flow and struggle. Good and evil work together to move us toward higher consciousness. David Spangler, one of the more bold new spiritualist writers, said this explicitly. Christ is the same force as Lucifer. Lucifer prepares man for the experience of Christhood. Lucifer works within each of us to bring us to wholeness as we move into the new age. Evil isn't really evil then, and good isn't really good. As confusing as this seems, the new spiritualist believes it all works out in the end. Using a biblical example, Kevin Ryerson says, criminals and murderers sometimes come back around to be murdered themselves, or perhaps to become a saint. For instance, Moses was a murderer. He beat the fellow to death out of rage, which was not exactly the most ethical decision, but he went on to become a great intellect, a great lawgiver, and is considered a saint by many people. So basically, you get many chances. Your karma is your system of judgment. There is justice. Morality, then, is nebulous. Establishing a system of ethics that works for everyone is impossible. We might be able to discern what is right for ourselves, but we cannot know whether others are doing what is right for them. If this seems incoherent, new spiritualists say it is because you are not sufficiently oriented to the flow of consciousness. You are too focused on how your thoughts will lead you to truth. Stop thinking. Get in touch with your true self. As Captain Kirk said in one of the original Star Trek episodes, sometimes a feeling is all we humans have to go on. So are the laws of logic just what so are the laws of logic just what we feel to be true? Is there ever a time when we should persuade others to act differently? And on what basis would we do this? Is morality ever anything more than an expression or preference? Were Hitler and Stalin just expressing a different morality or a wrong one? Is it possible for people to grow in moral understanding over time? Is there ever any moral course of action we ought to pursue as humans, or are all moral beliefs just expressions of cultural prejudice? Oh boy. 6. Postmodernism. Oh, this is going to be good too, I can tell. Yeah. Secularists and Marxists ground their ethics in atheism, materialism, and naturalism. Postmodern ethics is a bit more enigmatic. Basically, postmodern ethics looks with suspicion on both revelation and modern reason as sources of truth. The respected Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman frames the postmodern view as follows. I suggest that the novelty of the postmodern approach to ethics consists first and foremost in the rejection of the typically modern ways of going about its moral problems. That is, the philosophical search for absolutes, universals, and foundations in theory. The British essayist Adam Phillips states bluntly, universal moral principles must be eradicated and reverence for individual and cultural uniqueness inculcated or instilled. The rejection of both revelation and reason is evident in the writings of the philosopher Richard Rorty. In Achieving Our Country, Rorty questioned God's place in the moral scheme of the universe, referring to Walt Whitman's statement, "And I call to mankind, be not curious about God, for I, who am curious about each, am not curious about God," Rorty said. Whitman thought there was no need to be curious about God because there is no standard, not even a divine one, against which the decisions of a free people can be measured. Americans, Whitman hoped, would spend the energy that past human societies had spent on discovering God's desires, on discovering one another's desires. After denying God's existence, or at least relevance, Rorty moved on to deny the existence of any universal moral reality, to which our moral judgments might hope to correspond, as our physical science supposedly corresponds to physical reality. So if neither revelation nor reason can act as guides, what can? To postmodernists, here's another French guy, Jean-Francois Lyotard. Jean, Caitlin, how do you say that? You can ask your dad. The answer was right action. But what constitutes right action? Lyotard, for his part, was content to live with little narratives. If philosophical truth, so what we can know about reality, resides in the local community, it follows that moral truth, how we should behave, resides in the same community. This was Lyotard's way of expressing cultural relativism, the belief that truth and morals are relative to one's culture. Postmodernists often hesitate to use the term cultural relativism or relativism. Rorty, for example, tried to soften the word relative. He commented, "This view is often referred to as cultural relativism, but it is not relativistic, if that means saying that every moral view is as good as every other. Our moral view is, I firmly believe, much better than any competing view, even though there are a lot of people whom you will never be able to convert to it. It is one thing to say, falsely, that there is nothing to choose between us and the Nazis. It is another thing to say correctly that there is no neutral common ground to argue our differences, that Nazi and I will always strike one another as begging all the crucial questions, arguing in circles." Okay. While there is no objective basis for determining what is right, Rorty insisted his view was right when compared with, say, Nazi morality. But while making this claim, he also admitted there is no way to judge between the two views. Obviously, not all postmodernists agree with this. In fact, some would express serious disagreement, but we'll let Rorty's books speak for themselves. In the final analysis, postmodernists say each community places moral standards on its members' actions. Every culture has its own set of moral standards, and these standards evolve according to the dictates of the group. Abortion, for example, used to be viewed with revulsion and horror. Now it is widely accepted as distasteful but necessary. The narrative has changed. What we consider to be real now is different from before. But why do postmodernists like Rorty speak and write about moral issues if morality does not actually exist independent of our minds? Rorty's revised pragmatism works backward. Christian ethics would say, here's what God is like, so this is how we must act. But Rorty would say, here's how we think we should act, based on our formative story. So let's now develop a theory to accommodate it. The result is an ethical stance saying that somebody's rights are based on the fact that they were once wronged. You were once oppressed as part of an oppressed group. Let's build a theory of ethics in order to privilege you at the expense of those whom you judge to have been your oppressors. This reverse thinking about ethics is why Rorty considered words as merely tools of persuasion. He believed he could use words to move people who live in certain ways to see the world as he wanted it to be and then do what he wanted them to do. Not all postmodernists agree with Rorty's willingness to tell people what to do. Postmodern psychiatrist Adam Phillips sees any ethical boundary as a form of pontification and imperial self-aggrandizement. No adult can know what's best for another adult, and by the same token, no group or society can know what's best for another group or society. Phillips's stance seems more in keeping with the overall postmodern mindset, which does not allow anyone to be right on any particular issue, including ethics. We'll stop there for a minute.